Hello, everyone. This is Derek Taylor, your professor for HIST 129, the History of Early Modern Europe. And this is the final lecture in our course for this semester, which is a wrap-up to sort of put a bow on everything we've done, which I'm calling Towards Modernity, Europe after 1789. Don't worry, this is not a deep dive into Europe after 1789. That's what I mean. The other courses in the sequence of courses at JCCC, but just to give you a sneak peek and sort of retrospective of how early modern Europe feeds into the modern world. And I gave you, I give you these slides to look at in my lectures. I'm so old-fashioned, but I like giving you these images. This image is actually what I want to talk about to start with here. My lecture slide, you see this is a battle. And this is, in fact, a painting from 1832 of a battle in 1792. Just 3 years after the French Revolution started, probably the most important battle you've never heard of. And it's the Battle of Valmy in 1792, a minor battle in military terms, only a few hundred deaths on both sides and maybe a few thousand casualties on both sides in total. The French Revolutionary Forces at that point, there was a revolutionary army in the field, defeats a combined Austro-Prussian force on September 20th of 1792. And this is of humongous significance. Why is this of humongous significance? At this point, the revolutionary government has already begun going down a radical path. The mobs in Paris, for example, earlier in that month of September 1792, because they're already at war. That's something I should mention. By the time we get to 1792, revolutionary France is at war with most of the powers of Western Europe. Once they realize how radical at first, a lot of these, Britain, for example, welcomes the revolution. They're glad that their great enemy, France, is seemingly abandoning its absolute monarchy, seemingly, coming around to a British way of thinking about things, having restraints on the monarchy. But quickly this turns once the revolution becomes radicalized after 1791. And it begins bowing to the pressures of the mobs. And in September 2nd, 1792, the crowds in Paris reacting to the loss of a key battle at Verdun, basically gave into demands for the crowd to have tribunals set up for prisoners being held in Paris, and basically forced the jailers to bring out these prisoners and executed 1,300 people for basically having had some sort of noble privileges before the war. It's basically just judicial murder by another name. Why is this a humongous battle? Because as the revolution is becoming radicalized, it loses almost every battle in the field once it starts fighting with these forces. The Prussians, of course, have the best army in Europe. Austrians, of course, if you don't know, I meant to mention this in the last lecture, but of course, the Queen, Marie Antoinette, who, by the way, did not say, let them eat cake. That's an apocryphal thing, dreamed up by her enemies. She's Austrian. So the Austrian monarchy, once it seems like she's in danger from revolutionary forces, they decide to invade to try to restore the French monarchy. They're trying to overturn the revolution, is the point. And as you're going to see, for reasons that will become apparent in a moment, the French army was in disarray for most of the part of that first part of that war in 1792. But they managed to be a little bit better organized at Valmy. They had better artillery. And so they halted the Austro-Prussian advance. The victory was a huge one for the French Revolutionary government. It was its first victory. It psychologically emboldened them, and they shortly thereafter would abolish the monarchy. Again, a year, and we're going to see things would move pretty quickly into a violent, well, it's already been violent, but a more violent direction as a result of this. What's interesting about this is that it gave, and again, in strategic terms, the victory gave the French Revolutionary government time to consolidate itself. The question is, why didn't the Austro-Prussians, um, pushed the attack. They decided it would make no difference if they retreated and then resumed operations in the spring. And this goes back to, well, you'll see in a moment why this was a huge mistake. In other words, they didn't realize why this was significant. One person there did, who was present that day at the Battle of Valmy, did. And he was along with the Austro-Prussian army. And when he saw the Austro-Prussian army retreat, he said to his friends, I have the quotation here, "From this day forth begins a new era in the history of the world," unquote. Besides giving the French revolutionary government time to reorganize itself, why is this a historic moment? We don't often recognize real historical moments, but real importance when they happen, because sometimes, as you're going to see, it's only with time, retrospectively, you can get the meanings of things. And by the way, that observer who made that very, very foresighted comment was the great poet and playwright Johann von Goethe. He knew what a sense of history, what had just happened. Well, what had just happened? You need to go back a couple of years to get the full meaning of this. It wasn't just a battle that gave the revolution strategic time to get its act together. It was much greater than that, because it was in 1790 or 1789, but previous to this, the revolutionary government had issued a levée en masse. What is levée en masse? Levée en masse is basically the first universal national draft or conscription to raise an army. One of the things that happened with the abolition of feudal privileges in 1789 was the army lost a lot of its commanders, partly because there's no longer any feudal privileges, partly because most of these people are aristocrats, a lot of them flee the country. So there's not a lot of leadership in the French Revolutionary Army when it gets started. But what it does is, by basically drawing on the force of the entire nation, builds the biggest army Europe had ever seen. The levée en masse produces an army of 800,000 men, the biggest army that Louis XIV had ever fielded in his reign as king was 140,000 men. In the age of absolutism, armies had been a really expensive thing, and they were expensive because you had to raise troops, which usually meant sending out impressment gangs to sort of grab people off the street who didn't want to be in the army, who were kind of poor, who couldn't do anything to get out of it, because these weren't national armies, this is my point, in the age of absolutism. And you had to provide for them, feed them. What's going to happen with raising these revolutionary armies is, well, first of all, they're going to be very different. They're not fighting for a king anymore. What are they fighting for? They're fighting for the nation. They're fighting for the patria, the homeland. And so they are much more fervent as soldiers in the soldiers of the armies of the kings of Europe. They also, in the course of the coming wars, will learn to sort of basically supply themselves by taking whatever supplies they can. So they won't need over time to have the same sorts of supply that these earlier armies did. It means they can move faster. It also means, and this is basically how in the early battles the French Revolutionary Army begins to win over time, is they begin just winning by sheer force of numbers. They throw troops at people. What I'm not getting to here is by 1793, they're at war with virtually every major army in Europe. And they win. And they win partly because of numbers, partly because of enthusiasm, but also partly because with the abolition of these feudal privileges, at first they're in disarray, but within a few years, you have meritocracy. And so accomplished soldiers become generals, generals become leaders of the armies. This is where you will get people like Napoleon Bonaparte later on. And so it produces this stunning, this very different style of fighting. Because it is no longer, again, the armies of the King of France versus the armies of the King of Britain or the armies of the King of Prussia. This is a nation in arms. And that's what's so significant about the Battle of Valmy and what Goethe recognized. The nation had defeated one of the best armies in Europe. Prussia is the great military state. Again, remember I said about the revolution in 1789. The revolution is declared in 1789 in the National Assembly. It's made good at on the battlefield of Valmy, because the basic thing that every government has to do is be successful enough in warfare to maintain the security of the regime. And so Goethe was right. It is the beginning of a new world. And they move quickly, of course. And I won't go through the whole course of the revolution. That's a whole nother course. Within a year, of course, they've executed the king. Again, they start declaring war on everybody. And why would they declare war on everybody, by the way? Why would, okay, you freed yourself from, absolute monarchy. You freed yourself from feudalism. Why do that? Well, you've got a national army. One of the things that's firing that sense of nationhood is not just traditional patriotism. This is where the modernity of the revolution comes into play. They're not just fighting for their homeland, they're fighting for what they take to be their freedom. Remember, they're not just a citizen army, they're free and equal citizens, the entire nation. Think of this as, if you go back to Jean-Jacques Rousseau, his social contract, this is the volonté générale in arms. And so this is a radically different form of army in that regard, who is fired not only by more perennial ideas of nationhood or patriotism, but by ideas of universal equality, universal freedom. And so this is why, once the revolution basically conquers through violent bloodshed the old order, they're going to turn that on the rest of Europe. Why? Because they're not fighting for just their own regime. These are, again, Enlightenment sees things in totally universal terms. And so even after Napoleon takes over as a dictator, the same sort of impetus of having to revolutionize other countries, because what you believe are universal beliefs, and you're going to bring, you're going to make the world safe for Enlightenment, basically, at the point of a gun. At one point, and I don't remember where this was, I think it may have been in Italy, one of Napoleon's armies later on in the Revolutionary Wars came into a town. The colonel or whatever who's in charge of the detachment has all the townspeople come out in the center of the square, and he gives a speech to them and tells the people that, greetings, we have come to give you liberty and equality, but don't let it go to your heads. The first one of you who stirs without my permission will be shot. And so you should think of this as I'm connecting this, by the way, obviously with what the modern US government has been doing for the last 20 or 30 years. You're going to bring freedom, quote unquote, to the benighted peoples of Europe. You've already brought it. You've already brought freedom to the benighted peoples of your own country. Now you're going to export that through military might and through economic might. This is why I'm focusing on this as something that will feed into modernity here, and there is a connection in that regard. So you have nation building with and this does, this has an impact. Obviously, we're still living through the effects of things like this, not directly us as Americans, but this idea that you're going to do this. This happens, by the way. You can see something similar happening later in the 19th century, after the American Civil War, because what the reconstruction of the South was for the radical Republicans, who they wanted to punish the South to a certain degree, but they literally wanted to impose what they thought of as being a modern society on them by force of arms. That is essentially a similar thing. That's what, again, was effectively attempted in places like Iraq and Afghanistan by the United States government. So this is a map of Europe in 1800, roughly the time we're ending this course. And I mentioned I'd show you maps in the beginning. And these maps are all relative because lots of things are relative. Borders are a tricky thing, but you can kind of see by 1800, on the cusp of a modern world, you can see how many how many states here are kind of lurching towards something like France, Britain, Spain, like modern nation states, because that's where I'm going with this. Denmark and Norway. Smaller states are easier to do that with the Dutch Republic. But you still have a couple of areas that are not quite modern in that sense. Germany and Italy. Not surprisingly, that's where two of the great revolutions of the 19th century will take place. But by 1800, you have this, again, remember I talked about it that's why I gave you all those boring lectures on sovereignty and stuff like this. What happened to the Revolution of France is one sovereign replaced another. King was replaced by the nation. That, by the way, does not usually happen peacefully. So, and that's what's going to happen. That's one of the things that creates our modern world, is the violent overthrow of the old regimes. And you actually see, by the way, you can see, and these are relative, approximate, but these are population numbers at the end of about 1800 or so in Europe, and you can kind of see just how big and how small some of these countries are. Something I want to talk about here is we're talking about getting into modernity. What is modernity? I'm not going to give you a pat answer, but one of the things, of course, I'm talking about is nationalism. The nation state, modern nation state, are definitely part of modernity, to my way of thinking. But you already are on the cusp of other things. One of the other major great changes, from my perspective, is industrialization. One of the things that happens across the early modern period that's just about to, it feeds into the explosion of population in the 19th century is industrialization. And there's population growth all throughout this period. Remember how I talked about by 1500, Europe was just beginning to recover from the outbreaks of the Black Plague in the Middle Ages. In fact, it's increasing. Population is from between 1500 and 1750, roughly, again, depending how the numbers, I'm not going to be exact with this, but around 60 million people or so in 1500. It's up to about 128 or so million people in 1750. By 1800, it'll be, again, somewhere between 150, 180 million people. And so long term, you have, depending on what if you go on the highest estimates, a tripling of population in this period, even though you still have serious outbreaks of plague in the 17th century. And population actually dips in many countries in the 17th century because of the 30 Years' War. Nonetheless, things begin to change again by the end of this period. The last outbreaks of plague, I think the last instance of plague in Britain is like in the 1720s. I believe the last instance of plague is in the 1720s in France as well. And I think the 1770s in Russia. Also, famine begins to disappear at the same time in the 18th century. All this means, of course, your population is going to be growing, even though it's dwarfed by the population growth of a later period because of industrialization. At the same time, you have increasing, if still very small, levels of urbanization. In 1500, there's only about 5% of the population that lives in cities of 10,000 or more. Now, by 1600, it'll be a little over 7.5%. It's very slow growth. The number of people living in towns of more than 20,000 between 1600 and 1750 will double from 4 to 8%, about half the total urban population. By 1700, about 15% of Europe's population lives in towns. So it's a very small level, even though it's growing even before industrialization. By 1800, by the way, 40% of people in Britain live in towns. So it depends on the place you're at, but it's a prelude to the greater urbanization that takes place. And I might point out to you, by the way, there are countries in the world that are urbanized before they industrialized. The most famous example of this is, to give a comparison in global terms, is Japan. Japan is fully urbanized by the 18th century, even though they have no heavy industry of a modern sort. But Europe's getting there, the beginnings of it, which are going to make that happen. And of course, probably not coincidentally, the other thing I didn't barely mention in any of my lectures, because it doesn't come to fruition to the 19th century really, but one of the big dividing lines, another big dividing line between what we're calling the early modern period and the modern, is the Industrial Revolution. It begins in Britain at the end of the 18th century. After 1750, you have the first, factories that are being run on, by water mills, but also later on by steam engines, by steam powered, by other types of inventions in Britain. And so it begins there first, and that is an absolute dividing line. In fact, that's not even a dividing line between early modern and modern. That's a dividing line between that and all of human history. You can't overdo industrialization, I don't think, its significance. The rise of the nation state, the rise of industrialization, all very important keys, which we're almost on the cusp of by the time what we call the early modern period finally comes to an end. Another thing that's coming to an end, and again, this is only beginning with the French Revolution, is the end of what I'll call, for the better sake of the term, Christendom. In effect, if you're talking about the unified entity of Christendom, it already died with the Reformation in the 16th century. But despite that, you still have people who think in those terms. And pretty much, again, even at this point, most people outside nobility, educated bourgeois, they still have a pretty basic Christian worldview, even in 1800. What's going to change that going forward? Again, the great revolutions are the biggest things. They will entrench in law, Enlightenment ideals, which will cut against traditional Christian doctrines of, one faith, one church, stuff like this, religious toleration, religious freedom, stuff like that. Later on, you're going to have the first schemes for secular education begin to chip away at that as well. This happens first in France. They begin creating academies that are effectively out of the hands of the church during its more radical phases. But even then, you'll have a plan for this. It really remains, does education, in the hands of clergy in almost all European countries until the later 19th century. It's only after, I'd say from the 1870s onward, that begins to change at a university level, at a local level. That, of course, is huge. Of course, what you teach your kids is what they'll believe later on, for the most part. So that's a huge change. And that's where you get this to the state where we have today. That secular nation state monopolizes education, and that is definitely a modern thing. That is definitely not historically normal compared to earlier periods in European history or world history, I might add, in that matter. So huge changes in the offing, already on the cusp of it by 1789. And yet, to bring this all back together, we started out with, what Europe was like in 1500, how it was emerging from a darker period. You can see all the sort of things that were in the background of it, the Enlightenment success, I think, in the latter part of the 18th century. Again, plagues going away, famines going away, populations growing. Things are literally physically getting better. You can see why Enlightenment notions of progress took off in that era. And I would say, despite all the things that have happened in the 20th and 21st centuries, the Enlightenment still dominates our public life. For all the talk about getting beyond it, for all the talk about critics of the Enlightenment, and the critics of the Enlightenment have a lot to say that's very true, it seems to me it's still dominant. So, again, in that sense, we're still living through the early modern period in intellectual terms in a weird way when we think about it. And so retrospectively, we can see, how long-lived these ideas are, why it's important to study this period you've just gone through. Secondly, despite the fact that Christendom is gone and individual belief in Christianity is declining, as well as institutional, the cultural habits, and yes, still sometimes beliefs of Christianity are still very much with us. And this kind of goes with the Enlightenment, because as I've talked about in some of my lectures, Enlightenment sort of piggybacks on, Christian history and Christian ideas. I'm not sure you could have had what we call the Enlightenment in any other civilization. I'm not even talking about like Christianity versus other religions or Islam or something. I'm thinking I don't think you would ever have had an enlightenment of that sort in the Orthodox Christian world. It had to come, I think, because of the peculiarities of Western civilization, Western European civilization that made that possible. And therefore, it's kind of hard to get rid of what the Enlightenment grew out of if you really believe in the Enlightenment. I know this because people who like the Enlightenment and don't like Christianity complain about it all the time, but it just may not be something that may be connected, is my point. Say maybe. And I say that because as we're talking about moving towards modernity, into modernity, I said it already, I'll say it again. Sometimes, oftentimes, the meaning of events only become clear with time. And we don't know, in your own personal life, you can see this. Sometimes you go through something, it's traumatic, it's this, it's that, but you don't really understand what happened to you until much later on. It is definitely like this in history, the study of history, the writing of history. And I say this as someone, I have very old-fashioned views on the writing of history. My master's thesis advisor back at the University of Florida once told me that he didn't think you could write history without a lot of historical distance from the events you're writing. And so he thought you needed 100 years at least, because I say this because today we write quote unquote histories of everything that happened 5 minutes ago, which is fine. It's fine. I'm fine with it. But I do think you only really you do need a century or so, I think, to really do this. And partly because you need a lot of effort. Events like the Reformation, events like the 30 Years' War, the ideas like the Enlightenment, huge world historical events like the French Revolution aren't easily understood in their totality. Takes effort, takes not just specialists do it as a profession, but I think it takes, it takes a citizenry, a community who actually thinks about these things. One of your duties as an educated person is to think about things and have an informed opinion about things like the French Revolution. That's what an educated person should have, even if they're not, again, they don't have to be right, correct opinions, but it's something you should think about because it's, as you can kind of see, we're still living through the effects of these things. And so I think it's a duty to think about these things. When you inevitably leave these things behind, you'll never have time or inclination to think about them. When you hopefully go into the world and, God willing, make a lot of money, so you can kind of help me out if I, no, I'm kidding. So when you go into the world, you'll still be someone who, okay, I'm a banker, I'm in advertising, I'm doing this, but I still, you know what, I'm an educated person. I have an opinion, an informed one even, about, say, absolutism or, the Protestant Reformation or something like that. It is your duty, I think. That's why I feel so strongly about the importance of the early modern period. And the last thought to give you in all this is that, when I talked about periodization, how I don't take it as seriously and some historians don't, we use this because obviously the things we've talked about in this course I've talked about are a prelude to, in some respects, to our world, obviously, in others, I've talked about this as well, there's continuity with the early modern period, but again, sometimes I think, do we really know what period we're living in? Again, these are all retrospective abstractions for very complex realities. We like to think, you sometimes see people talk about, right, we're living through late modernity, late capitalism, late this, late that. I mean, we know we're at the end, coming to the end. Or, of course, there's less talk about this lately, but, post-modernity. We've already left modernity. And my last thought to give you is, what if we're still in early modernity? What if this is still the early modern world? We had never left it. Again, probably not, but it's still possible because we still, as I've said before, those things are still so much a part of the background of everyday lives. It's hard to get a real solid, objective view of it. Not totally impossible. I'm not a total relativist, but still takes a lot of effort. In any case, that, as they say, is that. And I want to thank everybody for your efforts this semester. I hope you've enjoyed this course. Feel free, if you ever want to, these videos will be on YouTube. If not forever, hopefully for a long time, you can go back and look at them. And again, hope you've enjoyed this course. Hope you have learned to love the early modern period of European history as I do. And hope if you guys see me around on campus or elsewhere, just say hi. I won't know who you are, but I'll definitely say hi back. So take care, everybody, and thank you all for a good semester.